talking about evolution in this lecture. Pretty much whatever it is that you need to know about evolution and why it's important is going to be discussed here. All right, so the big questions that we'll be exploring in this are, first of all, what is evolution? What are the three ways it occurs? What is the difference between artificial and natural selection? And more importantly, like, what is the point? Why are we talking about evolution in a class that's essentially about biodiversity? So what are the connectors here to this system? I want to say a couple things, first of all, about what evolution as a theory, right? So it is a theory. Now, we have, when we remember what theories are, we look at it as an overarching or umbrella idea, all right? So it is bigger than just whether or not we have a hunch about something or an idea or a hypothesis. Now, we use theories a lot in everyday lingo, and that do not line up with scientific theories. So it's really important to be able to distinguish this. Scientific theory has gone through lots and lots of testing. It can be refined and shaped, and the theory of evolution definitely has been refined and shaped over the years. And when you think about other theories, we have some really important ones. We have things like cell theory, right? The fact that all living things are formed from a cell. And there were 4 tenets to the cell theory. One of them actually was changed once we sort of kind of developed this idea that life comes from life, right? So cells are the basic building blocks. But the general idea about the theory of cells has not really shifted or changed very much. Another one is germ theory. And germ theory says that most diseases are caused by microorganisms. So it's funny because this one has been batted about for years and years. And in fact, many of the cancers that we are discovering can be directly tied back to microorganisms, to viruses. So germ theory is gaining even more support as we go along. So that's one. Another one is plate tectonics, and we're going to discuss plate tectonics extensively in our next unit. And plate tectonics is a fairly new theory. Now, they had ideas and things that they could kind of pull together, but as a theory, it's only been around since the 1960s, a cohesive theory. And the thing to remember about theories is that they're usually a very simply stated idea, right? And then everything, all the umbrella parts, the things come underneath. Okay, so the reason why I'm kind of harping on this is that we generally don't dispute too much about scientific theories. Now, we can, like I said, change certain things about it, but for the most part, we kind of all agree, right? We agree about cells. No one kind of comes at us and says anything that's too controversial. Plate tectonics are widely accepted by people, unless you're a flat earther, I guess. I don't even know. Germ theory. Now this one, a lot of old ideas still come about with germ theory. One is that people say things like, don't go out there, you're going to catch cold. Well, you don't catch cold, you catch a virus. And then the virus makes you have a cold, right? We're doing battle with this right now, right? Because we know that a lot of people do not accept that COVID-19 is a microorganism, or they think it was some sort of woo-woo manufactured virus that makes people sick, when the reality is it's a virus. So that's just important. Now, like I said, with evolution, we do have some controversies. We have people that, for whatever reason, mostly because they don't think it lines up with their faith system. You can be a person of faith and a person of science at the same time. There is no reason for that to be in conflict with each other. I have a whole lot to say about that. If you ever want to know what Miss Dixie thinks about science and faith, that's a big thing with me, and we could go through it, but we're going to move on. Okay, let's go. So what is the theory of evolution? The theory of evolution basically says that all species evolved from earlier species, right? So we had some other species, and then over time things have changed. Once again, we go back to this idea that life comes from life, and that you start with something and then you build on it from there. So this is actually not a Darwin idea. He also had a fellow evolutionary scientist who came along at the same time named Alfred Russel Wallace, who also coined or put together this idea. Darwin wrote a big old book, that's why he got the credit. But when you start to look at what the Greeks said, you're going to find some real tie-ins with those same ideas. All right. So when we're looking at this, we go back to what's called the phylogenetic tree, and I'll show you that here in just a second. The main concept of evolution is natural selection, all right? It has to do with whether we eat, we are being eaten, and we reproduce, all right? So it's about survival, right? That's what natural selection is about, and that organisms are under a constant struggle to do this. Now, along the same lines with natural selection, what we see is that individuals within the biodiversity of the genetic biodiversity, some individuals will have advantages over other individuals within that population. And those advantages make it more likely for them to survive. We know that people who carry diseases, basically genetic disorders or whatever, usually don't have as good a chance of surviving as people who don't, all right, and reproducing. So this comes back to this whole thing. Can you survive? Can you avoid being eaten? And are you going to reproduce? And are your offspring going to carry those traits forward? All right, so here's a picture of the phylogenetic tree, one of them. And so if you'll notice, we start with our stem reptiles. And we also know that there's a whole lot of things. We could probably put birds down here as well, because we know that a lot of dinosaurs came through this bird route, right? So we put the dinosaurs there, but birds are a part of that. And we could probably tie birds off up here as well. So there's a lot of common ground here. Now, when you're reading a phylogenetic tree, we know that things are closer to each other the closer the branches are. So when you look down here at some of these stem reptiles, you'll see that a couple of them just kind of trail off, right? Whereas others are actually more connected to each other. So when you look up here, you'll notice that snakes and lizards are more closely connected to each other or related to each other than a turtle. And how do we know this? If we run the tree backwards, we can see that it comes down here to the stem reptiles, but these two actually branch off much higher up in the tree, so they're closely related to each other. When you look at the crocodiles, you'll notice that they're in the same boat as the turtles. They actually come down here from the stem, so that's where their connection is more so. So lizards and snakes actually have more in common with each other than they do with turtles or with alligators. So one of the things we're learning through genetics is that we can actually do a lot of genetic tracing to connect things to each other. And they've done phylogenetic trees on COVID-19. So what they can do is they can actually trace it back through its genetics. Very interesting here, because the more sophisticated an organism is, the slower its rate of reproduction. We'll talk about that here in just a second. Okay, important note, populations evolve, not individuals. So we can't say things like, oh, I'm just evolving as a person. I'm just becoming a lot more kinder. Okay, you're changing, but you're not evolving, all right? In genetics, in biology, populations evolve, all right? It is the culmination of reproduction. So an individual themselves cannot evolve, but their offspring can. Okay, so one of the things that we deal with is myths, and these are some of the things that get us into trouble. The first one is survival of the fittest does not mean survival of the strongest. Once again, fitness has to do with reproductive success. How many offspring are you going to have? And how successful are you going to be at carrying those traits forward? All right, organisms develop traits because they need them. No. They survive because they had the traits that help them to survive, not the other way around. They don't develop the traits. Their offspring will get more of those traits as you move forward, but you're not going to develop them as you go. This one is the one where it gets us really kind of twisted up. All right, so there is a grand plan in which species become more perfectly adapted. So far, from a biological and scientific standpoint, we cannot identify what this plan is, what this grand plan is. So I'm going to show you something right now. Phrase of the day. Can you see those? It says, no one expects the Spanish Inquisition. All right, so how do things evolve? There are three ways. The first one is through mutations. So there's an actual change in the DNA. We're seeing this with COVID-19. It is mutating, and it is mutating to be more successful. All right, so usually mutations involve things like exposure to chemicals. It could be man-made chemicals, or it could be passed on as a heritable trait. So most of the time when we talk about mutations, however, we talk about things that are sort of a negative. Most of the time our exposure to radiation isn't going to make individuals more likely to overcome it. It's actually going to cause the gene to kink up, and then we got problems, mostly cancer. All right. Adaptation means that you are passing along your favorable trait to your offspring. Once again, how successful are we going to be, right? It's all about reproduction. All right, so giving your offspring that advantage. In other words, if you have a trait that has allowed you to survive and get to the point of reproducing, then you're going to pass those traits on to your offspring. Genetic resistance, and that is the ability of one individual to tolerate a chemical designed to kill it. We are finding a lot of antibiotic resistance, and the reason is we have used them way too much, right? So what happens is and this has to do with the fact that bacteria, remember antibiotics work on bacteria. So the bacteria are tiny, right? And their genetic material is very, very limited. So they have limited DNA. And what this means is that they can mutate at a faster rate, or they can evolve at a faster rate. So what we're seeing is that within the last 150 years, as long as we've been using antibiotics, which really hasn't been that long, right? Since basically World War I is how long we've been using it. So in the last 100 years, what we've seen is the development of what's known as the superbug. Now the superbug is essentially a bacteria that has now become resistant to antibiotics. We also are seeing that the superbug is becoming resistant to, get this, hand sani. one of my students used to call it hand sandy, and I never call it anything but. So what we're seeing is that we have stepped up our usage of hand sanitizer, and we are developing now superbugs because of it. They're not going to be killed by your use of hand sanitizer. This is why it's so important that you wash your hands first. Okay, use hand sanitizer as a last resort. If you don't have any other means of washing your hands right then you can use the hand sanitizer. But don't go first to the hand sanitizer. Wash with soap. That's my throw in. Okay, so how does it happen? One is through speciation. Speciation is simply one species that splits into two. All right. And over time, that what will happen is that they can no longer breed and produce a fertile offspring. So once again, we're coming back to reproduction. So they can't produce a fertile offspring. So a classic example is that we had you have two things that are going alongside each other, and as they split into two, eventually they can no longer reproduce. Or if they do, they can't produce fertile offspring. So the liger, for example, the liger does not have babies. The mule doesn't have babies, and they're all male. So they can't have babies. Okay, so just kind of keep that in mind. Okay, microevolution is sort of what we're doing, where basically you have changes or evolution occurring on a smaller, lower scale. So color of things, flavor, being able to breed for size, but they're still able to reproduce. Microevolution is just a whole new genre. So we're moving on up in the beyond just the species level, but now into other things. Okay, so they're usually what happens with speciation is you have to have some sort of separation, something that keeps them apart from each other. And what that does is it cuts the gene flow. There's a couple of ways in which this happens. The first one is called allopatric speciation, and this is geographic isolation. So the classic example is you had at one point in plate tectonics, you had Africa and South America, the same thing, right? And eventually the plates started to separate them away from each other. And eventually those organisms that could pass freely between those two continents now no longer can. They can't get across the ocean, so they started to speciate. They started to develop in those things. Learn this word, allopatric. Okay, allopatric. Sympatric, different word. So this one, allopatric is natural. Sympatric, on the other hand, is something that humans do. And what we do is we start to breed things for our own preferences. Okay, so when we do this, we suddenly move from diploid. Everybody remembers diploid means two, right? Our two sets of chromosomes are diploid, but now we move into polyploidy. So polyploidy, I'm going to highlight that for you. Polyploidy. That means more than two. All right. So in other words, if I want to get an orange to taste a particular kind of way, I can actually take the genetics from that. Well, I'll give you even better. Today I ate a nectarine for lunch. A nectarine. A nectarine is a combination between two different species, and they pulled the genetics together and gave it the best of both, right? So it looks like a peach, tastes a little bit like a peach, but its skin is smooth. So it has the qualities of both of those species that we bring together. We do this more with plants than we do with animals, although we're starting to kind of move over. So once again, let's highlight that just a little bit. We have our allopatric meaning it is geographic. And then we have our sympatric, which is human caused, mostly human breeding. Okay. So in the process of the geologic things, the things that cause this allopatrism, we first of all have plate tectonics. So the separation of land masses over time, over a long period of time, separated the genetics. Another thing that could happen is volcanic eruptions. So these are basically like large-scale habitat fragmentation. So a volcano erupts, it causes, destroys habitats, but it also usually causes a separation between species. Another one is just general catastrophes. So the Earth has gone through periods of cooling and warming, long periods of time. And when species are allowed enough time to adapt, so it requires enough time to adapt, then they're going to. Or we're going to see species develop with adaptive features, right? So one of the problems that we're having now is with loss of biodiversity, we are going through very quick climate change, and species just don't have the time to adapt to it. Why? Because they need to breed and reproduce over and over and over to get those traits out the way we need them to, or the way they need to be. We don't need anything. Okay. So genetic mechanics, or we have genetic drift. This comes about by random mating, and we see this all the time, that certain characteristics will rise to the forefront. By the way, there's a story in the Bible about genetic drift where one of the great patriarchs of the Jewish people, his father-in-law said, yeah, you can leave and you can take all the spotted goats, but you're going to leave all the non-spotted goats here. So he just separated the spotted goats and started breeding for spots. So we've been doing this for a long time. All right, another one is the bottleneck effect. And this is where you bring the species down to one limited number, all right? And this is one of the problems, and it can actually change the composition. So one of the things we're seeing right now with animals that are endangered is that they are getting very close to this, actually, this bottleneck effect is going to affect them in a big way. Once they become endangered, you have this size population, and all you have left is the genetics that are present in those species. Founder's effect are where you get yourself, where something swims across, doesn't come back, and so all the genetics that you have, all the genotype that's there, is whatever came over with the founders. Okay. So how does evolution happen? Like I said, when changes occur in the environment too rapidly, then species maybe cannot adapt enough, right? So our choices are: we adapt, we move, or we die. That's it. That's all we got. And if the changes occur too rapidly, then it's going to outpace our ability, or the species' ability to evolve. Now, like I said, the more sophisticated an organism is, the slower the rate of evolution is going to be. So if you have a short reproductive time, remember this is all about reproduction, then you're going to have faster evolution. So right now, one of the things we know is that COVID-19 is evolving rapidly. Why? Because it's a virus, right? So COVID is a virus. It's the coronavirus, right? So our coronavirus is it's a real short little piece of DNA, and the only way it can reproduce is by being in another cell, right? That's how viruses reproduce. But they've watched it goes. So there's two paths, and you can do some research on this. The coronavirus has actually moved from I think it's a G and a D, right? Right now, that's where they are, G and D, and one of them they think makes you a little bit sicker than the other, although it's still being looked at. But it has already split, right? So interestingly enough, one of the things we know about any disease is that they don't really want to kill you. They just want to make you miserable. Actually, they don't want to make you miserable. They want to live inside of you and reproduce. That's what they're hoping to do. They're hoping to reproduce. So if they kill their host, they can't reproduce, right? So they're going to, over time, evolve to where they're going to not kill their host, because that's the only way that the species is going to continue to move forward. That's good news for us, because what that means is that eventually it's going to get weakened unto the point that it won't kill many people. That's a really simplistic way of looking at this, but that's kind of where we're headed. All right, if you have a smaller population, it's going to evolve faster because the genetic material is really limited. And then finally, humans can actually speed up the process through our own manipulation. So think dog breeds, like we can get them to a point because we're manipulating them. All right, so can we adapt to new environmental conditions, such as, let's say that we don't fix the hole in the ozone and UV radiation comes through? Are we going to be able to adapt in time? No, we can't. Sorry, no. And the reason is because if there is no adaptive gene within the gene pool, it's not carrying forward. So there has to be the gene already present. Gene already has to be present, right? Already there. The other thing is that if we are counting on our reproductive capacity, in other words, are we able to reproduce fast enough? The answer for most large organisms is no. We don't have the time. It's going to go much too slowly. All right. So humans, when we look at why are we successful as a species, there's several things. One is that we have great thumbs. And it has allowed us to hold on to things and manipulate and move with good hand-eye coordination. Oh, and that comes to our big brains down there. So our opposable thumbs have been a good adaptive characteristic that we had. Ability to walk upright. So it's allowed us to run fast, be agile, and also we can then hold tools in our hands and chase. Because remember, it's about surviving and reproducing. We got to be able to get away. That's why. And then finally, our complex brains. By the way, this is our technology has approached such a great speed that it's going to outpace our own brains. And so this is going to be something we're going to have to really explore and ask ourselves, can we keep up with our own technology that we've created? That's a topic for another day. All right, and extinction. So we talked about the fact that if we cannot adapt quick enough, if species cannot adapt quick enough, then we are going to cease to exist. And when we do, that becomes a problem. So what are our choices? Once again, we have three. We can adapt, we can migrate, or we can die. That's all we've got to do. So extinction, migration, or adaptation are all we've got. And then an endemic species. So if we have a species that is only exists in one area, then that species is more likely to not be able to survive. So we have some problems right now in Australia because they're very specific. They had a lot of genetic allopatric um, isolation, and that leads to some problems with their species. Now, our background extinction rate, in other words, if humans weren't involved and things were allowed to go as they would naturally, the average is 0.0001% a year. Okay. Well, what that amounts to is 10 million species. If we had that many, 10 would go extinct in a year. If you have a mass extinction, that rate is anywhere from 25 to 95%. So we've recorded about 5 mass extinctions, and we'll talk about this more in our lecture on biodiversity. There's bad news, really bad news. And that is evolution and chapter 5. So, yeah, there you go. Bye.